Well, hello and welcome to this week's issue of Beering United, and I'm delighted today to have joined me here in my office Andy Weber. Andy is the Director of Finance and Operation for the Baptist Resource Network, and he's just a wealth of knowledge about legal matters and tax matters and organizational matters for churches, and many of you have accessed his help, I know, through the years. But recently, we were notified of a change in some of the laws that churches might miss because it may sound like it's something they don't need to be involved with. And I thought it'd be good today just to have Andy kind of apprise us of this and maybe talk a little bit about some things churches could do. So, welcome, Andy. Glad to have you join us today.
Thank you, Stan.
Now, recently, you and I were talking. There's been a kind of a change in the law that is affecting churches. So, kind of update us about what that is, and then we'll talk a bit about some solutions.
Sure. So basically, the Department of Labor has increased the overtime minimum wage threshold. And this is not a new law. This is actually a law that has been in place for quite a long time. The issue that's facing us now is actually the minimum wage amount to exempt personnel from overtime has actually more than doubled. In prior years, employees who made $23,660 could be exempt from being paid overtime. And now the Department of Labor has increased that amount to $47,476 annually. So we've seen a huge jump in this amount of wages paid to employees, which potentially puts some churches and organizations in a hard place in how do we now move to where we need to address possibly having to pay overtime.
So let me make sure I understand, because this does relate to churches then. So what's happened is that in the past, most churches would not have really dealt with this because the salary that they were paying for like a full-time secretary or janitor or something like that was always below the threshold. So if they worked a few extra hours one week, they weren't subject to this overtime. But now they've raised the ceiling so high that most of us, if we have a full-time secretary or a janitor, are going to fall under this law. Is that right?
That is correct. Now, the one thing that churches can evaluate, there is an exemption that the Department of Labor has historically honored, which is a clergy exemption. So we don't have to consider clergy into this equation, but we do need to consider whether it's a church secretary or administrative person, somebody who's not a clergy would need to be considered as a part of this.
Now they have to be full-time employed.
They would have to be full-time, and they could be salaried or hourly.
Okay.
And this would be anything that would be over 40 hours a week.
Okay, so 40 hours would be the measure for full-time. Okay.
Correct.
So let's run a scenario. Let's say that I'm a pastor of one of our churches, and I have a secretary who works 40 hours a week, and one week she's working, maybe 35. The next week she's working, 45. How does this law relate to me? Because I'm a church, this is not stuff I pay a lot of attention to, unfortunately.
Yeah, under the regulations, you're actually not allowed to average hours over weeks.
Okay.
So we have to look at a week-by-week scenario. If they work 40 hours this week and then they work 30 hours, then they work 35 hours, you can't average all of those hours to be 40 hours on average. It's 40 hours per week.
So even if they're salaried and one week they're working, 35, the next week they're working 45, even though they're salaried, those 5 hours that are over 40 hours a week, I would have to pay them time and a half, even though in our church salary structure, they're not an hourly employee, they're a salaried employee. Is that right?
That is correct.
Wow. Well, that's going to take some processing, because that's the kind of conversation that probably most of our churches don't really think about.
Yes.
So what are some solutions, Andy? I know there's a lot of maybe scenarios, but what are a couple things that maybe most of our churches could look at that would prepare them And by the way, also mention kind of the due date when this starts.
Sure. This goes into effect December 1st of this
Okay.
year, 2016. So we've got a few months to kind of plan out what that might look like. But one thing that a church can consider would be to first maybe budget some funds to pay somebody overtime.
Okay. So anticipate overtime based on maybe previous years, and just
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and build that into the budget. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good.
One thing that you can do, especially between now and December 1st, is evaluate how much your staff are working.
Okay.
So, are they really working 40 hours a week? Can things be um, revisited to where they're only working 38 hours a week instead of 42 hours a week? Can we shift some responsibilities to somebody else that could potentially handle this and not have to push us to where we need to consider paying overtime for staff?
So make sure that the necessity for overtime becomes more limited than perhaps patterns in the past.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
And one thing to mention too, as a church, we're a nonprofit, and we have the ability to utilize volunteers, which is a huge, huge blessing.
Yeah.
But one of the restrictions with this requirement is that an employee cannot volunteer hours that they would ordinarily get paid for the same type of work.
So like if a secretary knows that, this week we're doing the monthly newsletter and it takes 3 or 4 extra hours, they can't just choose to volunteer to come in on Saturday afternoon and do that and donate the time to the church. They can't do that.
Correct.
Okay.
As long as that's already a part of their defined paid job.
Okay. Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Well, Andy, obviously you've opened a whole Pandora's box of questions, and I'm so grateful that we as a staff and we as a BRN have you on our team, because you become just a real go-to person for help. So if folks have follow-up questions, we don't want to say call 1-800-ANDY. That we don't have that number. But they can email you by using the info@brnonline.org. That's info@brnonline.org with questions. Now, what are some? Where could they go to find other answers? What are some places you could refer them to?
Sure.
Other resources.
Probably the two biggest things that you could research would be to go to Church Law and Tax, which is www.churchlawandtax.com, or you can go to the Department of Labor website, which is www.dol.gov.
Okay. Now this is particularly relating to Pennsylvania. This is not a New Jersey issue.
This is a federal
issue.
so this will affect all states.
So Pennsylvania and New Jersey both will be affected by this. Okay.
Correct.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you for joining us this week. Let me just remind you, or at least bring to your awareness, that at our annual meeting in November, we're looking to plan some breakout kind of workshop conference times. And Andy will be leading one that's going to deal with some of the issues of taxes and legal stuff for churches. So I hope you'll join us for the annual meeting, if nothing else, to get more information about how you as a church can be more in alignment with the legal requirements, tax requirements that we have, both nationally, but also within the state of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So thank you for joining us this week, and I look forward to talking with you next week. Thank you.